Hello everyone, this is Christian Mount Exiton Interactive, and in this video we are going to create the ability for our component to communicate with the server. As usual, I want to remind you that you can find a link to the article for this video in the description below. And without further ado, we will begin. We'll go to Visual Studio. And what I'm going to do to start with basically is create sort of a bit of infrastructure. So we're going to create a new class. So I'm going to go into the services folder, right click, choose new, and we're going to add new item. It's going to be a TypeScript file. The name of this file is just going to be http.service.ts. This class, or the class here is just going to be the base class that all services will inherit from that need to communicate with the server. So to begin with, we're going to import, and from, what we're importing from is from Angular/HTTP. What we need is Angular's HTTP service. And we'll create this class, so export, and this will be an abstract class. So in order to use it, it'll have to be inherited from another class, and we'll just call it HTTP service. For the moment, all I want to do is create the constructor, and we're going to expect to have read-only the Angular's HTTP service passed in to the constructor. So for the moment, this is all we're going to need for this base class. Next, I'm going to return to our authenticator component file or folder, and we're going to create a new file inside of it. So add new item, and again it's a TypeScript file, and we're going to create, it's going to be called authenticator-http.service.ts. So obviously this is going to be the HTTP service for our authenticator. Again, we're going to import HTTP from Angular HTTP package. We need HTTP, and while we're at it importing, of course we're going to need to import the base service that we just created, and that's from, let's see, we have to go up to, and that's in services and HTTP service. Perfect. Next, we'll create the class, export class, authenticator, what I call HTTP service, and it's going to extend the HTTP service that we started with. Perfect. And now we'll just create the constructor here. So public constructor, and I'm going to expect Angular to pass in an instance of the HTTP service, and we need to call super and pass that in to the base class. And one of the primary reasons for the authenticator HTTP service is to hold reference to the URLs that we're going to need. And so I'm going to put those URLs in now. Not public, private, static, read-only. I'd really like them to be constant, but not available at the time of doing this video for TypeScript. And what we're going to want is the URLs to be of the form of /account. So that's the controller, and the action for this one is going to be check-username-availability. And we're just going to make the rest of them. First thing that we're going to deal with is actually checking for the username. But we'll just make the other URLs that we need. Actually, I think that's one too many. We're going to need a URL for forgot password. We'll need another one for forgot username. another for login, and last one for register. Now let's change the actual URLs. This one will be forgot password, forgot username, and login. Last but not least, register. Okay, so that will give us, for the moment, our Authenticator HTTP service. And what we need is to import that into our component. So we'll return to the component. Whoops. Let's say import. And it's in the same folder. So it's authenticator-http.service. This will be Authenticator HTTP service. Again, we're going to expect Angular to inject that for us. So I'm going to include that in the providers array. Next, we're going to go down to the constructor. And we'll say private, read-only, Authenticator HTTP service. And it's an Authenticator HTTP service. Perfect. Now I'm going to save. It will be rebuilt and come into wow, authenticator.component, because I'm an idiot. We need the from. Okay, guess I could check over there, make sure there's no errors, and we got the little green check mark finally. Built correctly, return here, and what we see here is this first error. So this error is saying can't resolve all parameters for Authenticator HTTP service. Let's return to that file. And it's pretty easy to know or which parameter is the problem because there's only one. So what it's basically telling us is that Angular has a problem injecting the HTTP service into it. The problem is that in order for the dependency injection for Angular to work, it needs more information. It needs information to know what to inject. And it gets that information through metadata tags. If we look in the component, we have this @component metadata tag with the providers. It's using, the compiler is creating a metadata for this class that tells Angular all it needs in order to inject these services. The problem is of course, in the Authenticator HTTP service, it's not a component, but the way that we're going to deal with this is to include another tag. So we're going to have to import, this one lives at Angular/core, and the one that we need is injectable. So we do the same thing as the component, so we'll say @injectable, and we'll put our parentheses. So that will give Angular information on how to, or what to inject. So let's return back to the browser. We'll scroll down. That was that error. Next error that we need to deal with is we're getting this no provider for HTTP error. And this is basically telling us that, okay, Angular knows what HTTP is. It just does not have a provider for it. The providers usually live, as far as I'm aware, in the modules. So what we need to do is to go back to our module definition. So this is in the app folder, the account-authenticator.site file. And what we need to do is to import a module. Not surprisingly, Angular, the module lives in HTTP, and that is the HTTP module. So we have to go down and include that in our imports. So now we've included that. Let's save. And we will return to the browser, scroll down, and we will see that we have it bundle rebuilding, bundle rebuilt. So this is all happening after the save. So now we have gotten rid of our errors. Let's see, what do I want to do next? Let's go back to our vendor.ts because we're about to use rxjs. So at the beginning of the series, maybe first video, second video, I don't remember, we talked about reducing the size of our bundles by only importing the parts that we need. In the case of Lodash, that meant that we, instead of import Lodash, we did import Lodash each, and we have the for own. So we're just importing the two things that we require. And I mentioned at the time that we would probably do the same thing for rxjs, except that we would want to get to the point where we could test what we were doing. And so we're at that point. So what I'm going to do is modify this import from rxjs to rxjs/observable. Perfect. And we do actually need one more, and that one's going to be rxjs/add/operator/toPromise. Now I'm going to save that. Now if we go back and take a look at our browser, we have our friend here that we saw last video when we were setting up the hot module replacement. Webpack is aware that what we've done has created a new bundle, but is unable to import that bundle into our browser because we have not set it up to accept hot module replacement in the vendor bundle. Okay, you can, of course, do one of two things. If you look, we could take this same code that we have in our account authenticator bundle and move it to the top of the vendor file. But for me, I just want to keep things as simple as possible, and the fact that we don't change the vendor.ts file except for very rarely, my solution to this is just going to be to refresh the browser. Of course, I'm doing this little hang up thing, so I'm going to rebuild the project, go back, refresh, and then it'll set up the hot module replacement again, and we won't have to deal with the vendor.ts file anymore. So once that comes up, let's take a look here. Yep, so we're back up and running. What we're going to do now is return to that base HTTP service class that we created. And we're going to start by importing a few things. So from the HTTP package, we're going to the Angular package, we're going to import also response. So of course, that's the response object from the server. And we're also going to import, from rxjs/observable. rxjs observable. Try that again. All right. So the first thing that I mentioned that we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that we can start checking the availability of a username. And the request that we're going to do for that is going to be a GET request. So I'm going to create a protected method called GET. For the moment, I'm just going to create a blank parameters list. So what we're going to want, the basics, and we're going to have to modify this a little bit later on here. The basics that we're going to need is a URL, which is of course a string. Next, we're going to need a way to respond to whether the server gave us an OK status or an error status. So what we're going to do is create a parameter called success. That's going to be a function that takes a response, which is of type response, and it's going to be a void method. We're going to do the same thing for error. It's going to take a response, which is of type response, and it's a void. Perfect. Now, by default, the observable basically sets up the way so that we can subscribe, so that we can have a connection to the server to monitor output over time. For us, at least for now,
we don't require that. All we want to do is send a request to the server and get the response back. I don't need to have a, we don't need communication to be open between the application and the server. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that observable and we're going to convert it to a promise. And I'm going to do that, for the get request, post request. I don't know if we do anything else, maybe put, but who knows. So I'm going to create a little helper method here. I'm going to call it private, and I'm going to call it do promise. Okay, so the do promise method, basically what it's going to do, we're going to have the same error and success functions. So let me just copy them down here. Actually, we might format it a little bit easier to read. But we need also to have, an observable here. Observable. It's of type observable. Observable is a generic type, so we have to tell it that it's observable of type response. Perfect. So that once we have this observable, so we'll take what was passed in, we'll use the toPromise function that we imported in our vendor.ts file. Then we'll say .then. Then we'll take in a function, do something with it, and we'll put down here .catch. Same deal, function. Perfect. So our functions themselves are going to take in the response. And for now, all we're going to, well, not for now. For this one, what we'll say is success, response, and you guessed it, error, response. So now what we need to do is to call that from the get method. We'll say this.doPromise. So we need an observable. The way that we're going to create that is just saying this HTTP. So we use the Angular's HTTP service. Say get and URL. And we need to tell it the success and the error. So I said, by default, basically the HTTP service, when you use the get, it returns the observable, which you could subscribe to. Of course, we've already talked about, in our case, we're just going to convert it to a promise. I'm going to save that. We're going to return to our authenticator HTTP service. And we need a method for checking the username availability. So we'll say public check username availability. It's probably the first time maybe that I've spelled it correctly there. So the check username availability is going to take the same error, success, and error functions. Move them over here. I'm not really sure where it's getting these response from, this interface from, but it's not the one that we want. So we want to come up here and import response from Angular. And of course, what we need also is to check, we're going to have a username. For this video, we won't actually use it, but we're going to need it eventually. So what we'll do now is just to say this.get, and we need the URL. So we made the URL static. It's the check username URL. We have to pass in success and error. So now we have set up the infrastructure for making the GET request from our component to the server. Now we need to actually have a way of doing it. And I previously in some video, one or two videos, mentioned that what we're going to do is the user, so it's going to be just register, but we use a login one. What the user is going to do is they're going to type in a username and then, probably check that it's valid. And what they're going to do is then move on to the next field, which would be the password, right? Once the user removes focus from the username, that's when we want to make the request to the server to check whether the username is available. And so to do that, we're going to return to Visual Studio. We're going to modify the template, so the pug file. what we're going to do is come down here to the form control group mixin and modify the input. So what we're going to do is bind to an event. So in order to bind to the event, we need the parentheses. And of course, the event that we're binding to is blur. So the blur gets fired, like I said, when the input loses focus. And we're going to bind that to a method. And we'll use the backticks for our string interpolation. And we're going to cleverly name the method on blur input. Method. We're going to put our double single quotes and then do the string interpolation for the key. So we're going to pass in the key as a string. I'll save that. I'm going to return to the component. We need to create that method. So it'll be public on blur input. Again, will be passed in a key, which is a string. And let's just check to make sure that we've got that hooked up correctly. So we'll return to the browser here. We'll get focus to the username, tab out. We get the control username, or the control username, control password, password confirm. So it's wired up correctly. So what we're going to want to do is that if the key is equal to this control username key, so if it's a username input that was blurred, what we're going to do is want to call a function here, and I'll say this dot check username availability. Perfect. So we need to create this method. So private. And of course, the only thing that this thing needs to do is to say this authenticator HTTP service, and we'll say check username availability. We have to pass in the username. So control username dot value. Okay. And we need to pass in success and error functions. And to do those correctly, we have to return to the top here. We're going to import, we need to import response from Angular HTTP. I mentioned we need the response. So let's return back to the method we just created. Where are you hiding? Right here. It's going to be response, which is of type response for both of them. So for the moment, all we'll do is say console log, say response.json. So that will attempt to convert the response body to JSON. We'll do it for the error as well. I'm going to save. Turn to our browser, bundle rebuilding. So we'll give it a second here. There we go. So let's go to the network tab and we'll go into the username. We will remove focus from the username and we see the request here. So of course it's a 404. We haven't set it up on the server yet, but it's important to note that we are apparently sending it to the right place, right? Account / check - username - availability. Magically spelled correctly. So that the response is going well. I do want to mention this one error, and it's a reasonable error. The problem that we're having here is that we're saying that once it succeeds or it fails, in this case it fails, that we want to take the JSON representation of the response body. Well, it failed. There's no response body to convert to JSON. So this is a logical error. Only reason I'm mentioning it is that most of the time, and I think that I'll do it this time too, is that I do also do some generic processing of a response in the base HTTP service class. For instance, if the excuse me, If the response from the server contains a property on the object that says, reload true, then I want to automatically refresh the browser, or redirect URL and it has a string, will automatically redirect to that URL. So we have to keep in mind when we're doing that, processing the response, that maybe a response may not have a body. All we cared about was the status code. So that's just a brief aside for later on. I guess we're at the point now where we have to actually add in the endpoint to the server. So what I'm going to do here is I have to return to the project. So the root of the project, I'm going to right click on Web UI. I'm going to choose Add New Folder. The folder that we need to add is named Controllers. Sort of a convention. So in this Controllers folder, we need to create a controller. So we're going to add a new class. That class is going to be called Account Controller. All right. So the first thing that we want to do here is to make sure that our account controller inherits from controller. And controller lives in the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC namespace. And get rid of the ones we don't need. So by default, what's going to happen is the route is going to be, the host name / account / whatever the name of the actions are. What I'm going to do is, we'll figure out a reason for why I'm doing it. We'll just call this, just to be specific, we'll say the route. In this case, we'll just say account. So just to be sure. So again, it would default to account, but we'll lowercase the account here. Next thing that we're going to do is to actually create the action. So it's a public, it's going to return an iAction result, and the name is check username availability. And to get rid of the error, we're just going to return something here. So we'll return OK, new anonymous object. Our object will have a property on it called message, and I cannot help myself. So hello world is back. If we tried to use this now, we would still get a 404 because it would be looking for check username availability. So /account / check username availability as just one big string. Of course, the way that we have set it up, we actually need it to be check -username -availability. And it's going to default to get, but we'll just say, just to be thorough, that to arrive at this endpoint, you should be making a GET request. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to hit F6 to rebuild the project. Succeeded. Of course, now we have if we scroll down at the bottom, we see that the connection reset, so we do need to refresh our browser for this. Let's go back to, let's see first. Okay, so go back to the network tab. I'm going to focus the username control, and then I'm going to remove focus. It's great. We're getting a status code of 200. So obviously it found that endpoint, and we'll return to our console, and we'll see that we're printing out the response from the server, which we could see here. So now we've set up the ability for our component to communicate back to the server. Of course, we need to add other endpoints to log in, register, forgot username, all that. We also need to modify both the request and the endpoint to deal with the fact that we aren't sending in. We'll have to send in the username for it to check and see if the username is available. But I think for now, that will do it for this video. As usual, I want to remind you that, or to say thank you for watching the video. And if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, whatever, please leave them in the comments section below. Other than that, I will talk to you later.